Today at 6, the desperate scramble to escape Afghanistan and life under Taliban rule. Some at Kabul airport hand over their children to US Marines, at least to get them on flights to freedom. Others beg Western embassies for travel papers.
These people have no real information about what they can do to leave Afghanistan, but they're desperate. In fact, they're coming to us. They're asking us, is it true? Will the Canadians give me a visa? The fact is, most of these people will never get one.
Really? The UK says it will continue to help people escape as long as the US military controls a billion disabled people.
We are the lucky ones. We made it.
And coming up,
there are lots of people who are really need help.
But one young Afghan boy who did make it to the UK falls to his death from a hotel window in Sheffield. And the Foreign Secretary says he won't resign over criticism of his overall handling of the refugee crisis. Also on the programme, new research finds the COVID vaccine offers strong protection against the Delta variant.
Are superheroes.
Really?
And the Paralympics join a global campaign to improve the lives of 1 billion disabled people around the world.
In Wales today, with record hospital waiting times, extra money to help the NHS recovery, but is it enough? And he fears for his life, the woman from the Vale of Glamorgan desperately trying to help a friend flee Afghanistan.
On the BBC News channel, Yorkshire County Cricket Club has apologised to former player Azim Rafiq after an investigation into allegations of racism.
Good evening and welcome to the BBC News at 6. There is a desperate scramble to escape Afghanistan as hundreds of people, fearing for their lives under Taliban rule,
on the BBC News channel, Yorkshire County Cricket Club has apologised.
Some in the crowds at Kabul airport are handing over their children to startled US Marines guarding the perimeter, hoping they can at least begin a new life. Many Afghans are trying to get exit papers from Western embassies and then head in hope to Kabul airport. In a moment, we'll have the latest from our correspondent Secunda Kamani in the capital. But first, Jonathan Beale reports now on the despairing efforts of many to leave their homeland.
Chaotic scenes outside Kabul airport. Hundreds desperate to get a flight to freedom. Even passing toddlers over barricades to troops guarding the perimeter. Their hope that if they can't get out, their children might. This gives a sense of the scale. Here, a thin line of British soldiers trying to keep order, with the heartbreak of having to turn away those without the right papers. And there are still fears for those left behind.
I love this country. I want to be in this country. International community, they talk about evacuating people who worked with them, which can be good. But people who are in Afghanistan, they are in need too. First of all, due to war from different provinces, some people came to Kabul and they don't have roof over their head and also they don't have food.
There is some semblance of order inside the airport, with military evacuation flights continuing. Britain says it's already flown out more than 1,000 people. It's aiming to do that every day. But it still depends on the Taliban, who control access to the airport. The US president still having to defend his decision to leave, at least like this. He had promised a safe and orderly withdrawal. He'd also set a deadline of getting his troops out by the end of the month. Now he says they'll stay until every US citizen's out.
So Americans should understand that troops might have to be there beyond August 31st.
No, Americans should understand that we're going to try to get it done before August 31st.
But if we don't, the troops will stay.
If we don't, we'll determine at the time who's left.
And
if there are American forces, if there's American citizens left, we're going to stay till we get them all out.
Britain also says it'll stay at the airport as long as the Americans remain. But it's the Taliban who control access. There have been acts of apparent defiance to their rule already, with some residents in Kabul parading the old national flag. It's Independence Day. But it's the Taliban who are now in charge and will decide what happens next. Jonathan Beale, BBC News.
Well, here the Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, has rejected calls to resign after being accused of a catastrophic failure of judgment in his handling of the Afghan crisis. He's been criticised by opposition parties after it was reported that he failed to follow advice while on holiday to call his Afghan counterpart last Friday to discuss evacuations. The Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, says such a phone call wouldn't have made any difference. Our political correspondent, Ben Wright, has the latest.
A potentially life-saving flight as the rescue continues. Up to 10 planes a day are carrying British nationals and Afghan evacuees from the chaos of Kabul to the UK. I spoke to a UK resident of Afghan origin, we'll call her Sarah, who's waiting to hear if her father and other family have made it out.
The practicalities of the situation are different than what the instructions want. I completely appreciate that there is efforts being made to have, you're saying, tens of flights landing every day and whatnot. It's not as easy as, well, we'll land a plane, you get there, job done. It's just not that simple, unfortunately.
There's now a rush to leave, and according to a report in the Daily Mail, government officials asked the Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab on Friday to urgently call his Afghan opposite number in order to arrange help for Afghans who worked for the UK. Mr. Raab was not at his usual desk. He was on holiday in Crete, and the call was delegated to a junior minister instead. Labour said he should be sacked or quit.
The idea that the Foreign Secretary wouldn't pick up the phone as the Taliban were advancing and standing at the gates of Kabul to see what we could do to help and to prevent Afghanistan descending into a base for terror again seems to me to be extraordinary.
There he comes.
But today, Mr. Raab shrugged off the calls to go.
Are you going to resign, Mr. Raab?
No. That was a no, and a cabinet colleague came to Mr. Raab's defence.
The only problem last week was not a phone call to an Afghan government that was melting away and had almost, or didn't have any leverage. The number one challenge at the end of last week was whether the airport would continue to fly, allow planes to fly out, and those people that we were getting out, would they be allowed to get out? That was the number one call. That was the only thing that mattered.
Dominic Raab insists he was working hard on holiday, getting back to Britain in the early hours of Monday after the Taliban had captured Kabul. One phone call might not have changed anything, but it adds to the picture of a government blindsided by events and slow to catch up. Today, Mr. Raab chaired talks with the G7 and other countries. This signal wasn't subtle. But there is cross-party anger at what's happened in Afghanistan, and the Foreign Secretary is feeling the flak. Ben Wright, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, our correspondent Secunda Kamani is live in Kabul for us now. Secunda, what hope is there that all those people begging to get out at the airport, that they might actually be able to leave?
Well, I was just there a short while ago. The situation there is a little calmer than it has been in previous days, but still very chaotic. Large crowds of people at the different entrances to the airport. Still seeing Taliban fighters whipping members of that crowd in order to try and control them at times. And some of those people who do have valid permission to travel, to be evacuated, are saying that they're struggling to get to the entrances of the airport because of the chaotic situation. But many of the other people who are there, they don't have any visas, they don't necessarily even have passports, they don't realistically have much of a chance of getting out, but they've just turned up there in the hope that somehow they'll manage to escape. And there's also been similarly chaotic scenes outside some of the foreign embassies. I was at the Canadian embassy earlier today, hundreds and hundreds of people just standing outside there, frantically scribbling their names and passport details on blank pieces of paper, which they're then handing to the Taliban, hoping that somehow that's going to reach the Canadian embassy. In fact, the Canadian embassy there has already been completely evacuated. Now, in other parts of the city, everyday life is somewhat resuming. I was at a snooker club earlier today as well. Young men playing snooker, on the face of it, normal life resuming. But when I spoke to them about how they feel about the current situation, all of them were deeply, deeply worried about the future.
Yeah, OK. Secunda, thank you. Secunda Kamani there, our correspondent live in Kabul. Well, here the government says the UK will continue to help people leave the country as long as the US military remains in control of the airport in Kabul. More British troops are being sent to help maintain order. Our special correspondent Lucy Manning has been speaking to one family who managed to escape Kabul and an interpreter who worked with British forces who's still trapped there.
To stay is dangerous. To try to go isn't much safer, but it's a risk many are taking. Gargasht Hidai worked in Afghanistan. A British Afghan, here pictured with the country's former defence minister, thanking him for his work. He and his family were flown out of Afghanistan 2 days ago by the RAF and are now quarantining in Manchester.
Yes, I feel good. We are safe. We will start back from scratch in the UK.
His wife isn't a dual national. She was told to stay behind and then struggled to get into the airport.
The situation is very bad because we were literally inside the compound. We could see the fighting, the shooting. She was crying. When we met her again in the compound, that was not the one of the officer was a British. He's an officer, British officer. He cried too.
How was the situation on the plane for everyone?
The situation was chaotic. The plane was completely full. I and one of my child were sitting on the floor.
With his work for coalition forces, he feared for his life.
We are the lucky ones. We made it, and there are lots of people who are really need help.
Others haven't made it out. These the certificates of a former British interpreter we are calling Abdul. Good enough to risk his life, but refused permission to come to the UK.
Around 10 days ago, I received another email. They are refused my case. I asked it, why you are refused my case? What's the problem? They told me your character, conjunction, association is not good for the UK people.
And what's your message to the British government?
My message is for the British Prime Minister, Minister of Defence, Home Office. Please see my case again, and I'm in a very dangerous situation. I will die.
The Home Office says it carries out thorough checks, but his bags are packed with nowhere to go. Lucy Manning, BBC News.
Police in South Yorkshire have confirmed that a 5-year-old boy who fell to his death from a 9th floor window of a hotel in Sheffield yesterday was a refugee from Afghanistan. South Yorkshire Police say they're providing support to his family. Our home editor Mark Eastern is here. What more do we know about the circumstances, Mark?
Oh, this is such a tragic story, Clive. This little boy, just 5 years old, had been evacuated from Afghanistan along with his 4 siblings and his parents. We understand his father worked for the British Embassy, and the family had travelled to the UK about a fortnight ago under the Home Office scheme to bring out interpreters and support staff whose lives obviously are at risk from the Taliban. Now, the Home Office has frankly been struggling to find accommodation for Afghan refugees, particularly large families like this one. I understand the hotel in Sheffield, the Metropolitan, had already been used to house asylum seekers. But in recent days, some of those asylum seekers had been moved out. Why? Because of concerns over the safety of the building, in particular the windows. But the Home Office is so desperate to find somewhere to put these Afghan refugees that they were put into that hotel despite those concerns. Now, in a statement, the Home Office has simply said, we're extremely saddened by the tragic death of a child at a hotel in Sheffield, and the police are providing support, and while the investigation continues, we're providing accommodation and support. But there are serious questions for the Home Office, I think. What steps were taken to ensure that this hotel was safe enough to put vulnerable families with young children into? And further questions, I think, because the Home Office has already come under significant criticism in recent months for the poor quality of asylum seeker accommodation. Why was a little boy who we'd apparently saved from Afghanistan allowed to die in England?
Sure. OK, Mark, thank you. Mark East. The origins of the war in Afghanistan lie in the attacks of September the 11th, when nearly 3,000 people died. Al-Qaeda had used their safe haven in Afghanistan to plan the atrocity, which eventually resulted in a US-led coalition to remove the Taliban government that sheltered them. But many of the relatives of those who died on 9/11 are angry at the US government's handling of the withdrawal. From New York, here's Ali Makboul.
In the soaring skyline of Lower Manhattan, there remains a heart-rending gap where the towers of the World Trade Center once stood. their footprints turned into memorials for the victims. Within a month of the horrific acts which took their lives, 7,000 miles away, military operations were being launched. Well, the war in Afghanistan, of course, was started in the name of those who died at this spot nearly 20 years ago, in trying to find their killers, in trying to ensure an attack like that never happened again. But some of those relatives left behind are now among those who are furious at how it's all ended. 40-year-old Catherine Wolfe from Swansea was working on the 97th floor of the North Tower when it was struck by a plane. No remains of hers were ever identified. Her husband Charles says there's no question the war was justified and that he'd certainly celebrated the death of Osama bin Laden, but that he's been shocked by recent events.
The situation that we just occurred in Afghanistan over the weekend was inexcusable, absolutely inexcusable. What they did was pull out. How they did it was absolutely wrong, absolutely wrong. After this debacle this last weekend, I do not feel proud of our leaders. I feel proud about our nation, but not our current leaders.
Each room has a little piece of Joe in it.
Christine Lem feels a huge amount of pride for her husband, Joe. He was in the New York police at the time of the 9/11 attacks and was one of those who pulled bodies from the rubble. That day was the reason he re-enlisted and went to fight in Afghanistan. But it was there that he was killed.
They went over there to make America safer after what happened at 9/11. So how are we safer now with the Taliban taking over? I'm sick to my stomach. Looking at a 20-year war where Joe and over 2,300 soldiers have died in the Afghan war, all to be given back to the Taliban. Joe was specifically killed by a Taliban suicide bomber.
Christine's son was just 4 years old when he saluted the coffin of his father. For all the sacrifice, there are suddenly fears the chaos far away means a new, more dangerous era here. Aleem Maqbool, BBC News in New York.
The government's latest coronavirus figures show there were over 36,500 new infections recorded in the latest 24-hour period, which means on average there were more than 30,000 new cases per day in the last week. 6,379 people are currently in hospital with the virus. 113 deaths were recorded in the past 24 hours, with an average of 96 a day in the last week. On vaccinations, 87.3% of adults in the UK have now had their first jab. That's now measured as the percentage of those aged 16 and over in the population. It was previously measured as a percentage of over 18s. And 75.7% of adults have had 2 jabs. And the biggest survey of COVID infection in the UK has found that both the Pfizer and AstraZeneca vaccines are still offering good protection against the Delta variant, the dominant strain in the UK. But researchers also found that fully vaccinated adults can harbour virus levels as high as those who are unvaccinated if infected with the Delta variant. Here's our medical editor, Fergus Walsh.
16-year-olds in Newcastle were taking up the offer of a COVID vaccine today, ahead of returning to school and college. New research shows the younger you are, the more durable the protection from the vaccine. And for now, they're being offered only a single dose. Analysis of PCR tests from more than 250,000 volunteers has shown the Delta variant is more able to cause infection in fully immunised adults than previous strains. The study found that 2 doses of the Pfizer vaccine initially gave more than 90% protection against symptomatic COVID infection, compared to around 70% for the Oxford AstraZeneca jab. But over the course of 3 months, the protection offered by the Pfizer jab fell significantly, whereas that of the AstraZeneca vaccine remained more stable. The researchers believe that both vaccines will offer similar and still significant protection at around 4 to 5 months. And it's worth stressing that the vaccines give very strong protection against severe COVID illness. The study also showed that double vaccinated adults harbour the same levels of virus if they get infected with Delta as unvaccinated people.
What that means is that they definitely have the potential to pass that virus on to other people. And so it's really important to take precautions. If you do get COVID, despite being vaccinated, don't assume you can't pass it on.
So what does all this mean for third booster doses, which ministers are planning to roll out for the over 50s from next month? The scientists who will make the final decision say it's still up in the air.
We do need to know that there are people who actually need boosting. We would want to avoid getting into a situation where we were giving boosters on a just-in-case basis, because you could end up being locked into a position of really not knowing whether your boosters were required or who or when they were needed.
But Israel is already offering booster doses to the over 50s in a bid to curb a huge spike in infections. Other wealthy nations plan to follow suit, even while most poorer countries have barely started protecting the most vulnerable. Fergus Walsh, BBC News.
It is 21 minutes past 6. Our top story this evening. The desperate scramble continues of people trying to escape Afghanistan and life under Taliban rule. And coming up, the most lucrative event in women's golf, the Women's Open, gets underway on the east coast of Scotland.
And coming up in Sports Day on the BBC News channel, the former Manchester United and Scotland striker Denis Law reveals he's been diagnosed with Alzheimer's and vascular dementia at the age of 81.
A new global campaign aims to improve the lives of the 1 billion disabled people making up 15% of the world's population. Called We the 15, many live in poverty, unlikely to go to school, and half are out of work. The International Paralympic Committee has joined the campaign ahead of next week's delayed Tokyo 2020 Paralympic Games. With more, here's Paul Carter.
The Leicester Cobras used to play every week, but like many other things, the pandemic put a stop to that. For players Sam and Ray, off the court, challenges as disabled people remain.
There's still steps everywhere, there's still not enough access or facilities when you get to the place where you need to go.
I have been discriminated against in employment, in general, in going about your daily life.
It was hoped that London 2012 would be a turning point for disability awareness in the UK. Some who won medals at those games say that 9 years on, despite a higher profile, disability rights is still heavily dependent on access to resources.
I'd go up and down schools in the UK with the message, it doesn't matter if you have an artificial leg, you can do anything. And about 5 years into that, I realized, gosh, that's not true. The reality is if you have a disability and a good chunk of money, you can do everything. What we are lacking, unfortunately, in different parts of the world is money and investment and a commitment that everybody should be able to fulfill their potential.
You are superheroes.
Really?
Yeah, we're superheroes, all right.
A new campaign led by the International Paralympic Committee is aiming to highlight and tackle the issues faced by the world's 1 billion disabled people, 15% of the global population.
We get married. We met on a blind date.
Called We the 15, the campaign brings together a host of international organisations across business, culture and sport.
We all break down these barriers.
It's beyond sport. We want to tackle employment, we want to tackle mobility, changing legislation in nations at an international level.
How do you ensure that that momentum is kept up and it gives us lasting change in 7, 8, 9, 10 years from now?
We cannot rely only on the Paralympics. If we rely only on the Paralympics, we will have a limited impact. That's why we need, the business sector, employment, access to education.
It's only a few days until the Tokyo Paralympics get underway, but measuring whether this campaign brings about change may take longer.
This awareness needs to go down to every day, not just oh yes, we've had the Paralympics, very good, and then, we all go back into wherever they think we go.
Paul Carter, BBC News.
Let's take a look at some of the day's other top stories now. And the number of people waiting for non-urgent hospital treatment in Wales has hit an all-time high. In June, there were 624,000 on waiting lists. That's around 20% of the population. Those needing orthopaedic or trauma treatment had the longest wait. A coroner has formally opened the inquest into the deaths of the 5 victims of the mass shooting in Plymouth a week ago. In a short hearing, details were given of the fatal injuries inflicted by 22-year-old Jake Davison, who turned his weapon on himself. And the former Manchester United and Scotland striker Denis Law, who's 81, has revealed he's been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. The 81-year-old says he'll be doing his best to tackle the condition and hopes to be able to continue watching Manchester United at Old Trafford for as long as he's able. Now, secondary schools in Glasgow are helping some of the city's poorest families to apply for benefits to which they're entitled, but fail to claim. It's a new initiative to try to stem the rise in child poverty in Britain, with the Social Mobility Commission saying almost 1 in 3 children, that's more than 4 million youngsters, are living in poverty. Our social affairs correspondent Michael Buchanan reports now from Glasgow.
Happy, carefree children at a summer camp for disadvantaged youngsters in Glasgow. The scheme provides fun and free food to families who'd otherwise struggle during the holidays. For mum of 2 Nicole Henderson, the camp, run by the charity Achieve More Scotland, has been a godsend.
Having clubs like this, I know, has been helpful because obviously they're in 9 o'clock till 3 o'clock, so people's not having to worry about where lunch is coming from or whatever, which is really good. I definitely wouldn't have been able to afford to send the 2 kids to a club every single day like this.
Around 1 in 3 children in Glasgow live in poverty. In an innovative scheme, the council is to link every secondary school in the city with a financial inclusion officer who will encourage parents to apply for benefits they're eligible for, but don't claim.
The solution to poverty is to get money into family households, into their pocket or their bank account or whatever, and that's where we're always challenged, is trying to reach out to these families. And the great thing about this programme is that it builds on that trust that parents already have with the local school.
St Mungo's Academy was part of a pilot project last year. They helped around 60 families claim nearly £200,000 in extra benefits. Money, they say, that's having a direct impact.
We have a lot of families that the young person's the carer for the parent because they've maybe got a mental health condition or they're struggling financially, and now looking at those families that we've already supported and seeing the difference in the young person in terms of even just their attendance, them actually accessing their learning, it's been significant.
Around 4.3 million children live in poverty across Britain, a figure that's on the rise, and other councils are showing interest in the Glasgow initiative. What this scheme taps into is a little-known fact about the welfare system. Around £15 billion worth of benefits are unclaimed. Money that millions of people could get, but don't know they're entitled to. A lack of money doesn't just mean children miss out, it adds to tensions at home, often reducing the time and space to study. This initiative could therefore lead to long-term benefits, as well as short-term financial gains. Michael Buchanan, BBC News, Glasgow.
The Women's Open Golf Championship has got underway at Carnoustie. A big increase in prize money means this year the winner will take home nearly £500,000. Here's our women's sport reporter, Jo Corrie.
The Women's Open at Carnoustie on Scotland's east coast, the final major of the year, and with an increase in prize money, now the most lucrative tournament. Fresh from her Olympic gold medal in Tokyo, all eyes were on world number 1 Nelly Korda, and she didn't disappoint, as 8 birdies saw her shoot into an early lead.
Will it hold its line? It will.
Last year's surprise winner Sophia Popov started well, but then this, Carnoustie by name, Carnasty by nature. She battled back though to finish on par. The British players have mostly struggled, but not former champion Georgia Hall. She shone on day 1, at one point topping the leaderboard, but now 1 stroke off the pace. Level with Scotland's Louise Duncan, an amateur taking her moment on the big stage.
Well, she's within one of the lead as well. Yeah, Dean is the...
At the head of the field are South Korea's Se Young Kim and Sweden's Magdalena Sagström, both on 5 under par. And up there level with them, ominously poised, is Korda. Jo Corrie, BBC News.
Time for a look at the weather news now, and Chris Fawkes has the details. Hi, Chris.
Hi Clive. Well, today's been another pretty cloudy day, and that's one of the more noticeable features of this year's August. It's not been dry everywhere, mind you. We have seen some fairly hefty showers recently develop across Wales initially, and then moving into more central portions of England. They'll be moving eastwards with time. But looking west, we've got low pressure lurking, and these weather fronts will be bringing us bands of rain over the next couple of days or so. So overnight tonight, those showers pushing into East Anglia and South East England before fading soon after midnight. We'll be left with dry conditions, but there'll be a lot of cloud around tonight and a few mist patches as well. Temperatures 10 to 14 degrees. Now, the first sign of that rain arriving, I showed you those weather fronts just a moment ago, will be for Northern Ireland, with the rain turning steady and heavy here. Further east for Scotland, England and Wales, I think there's a better chance of actually seeing some decent breaks in the cloud sheet and a bit more in the way of sunshine, at least for a time. And it may well stay bright for northern Scotland, eastern England and perhaps East Wales even into the afternoon. But at the same time, rain will be starting to arrive for West Scotland, northwest England, northwest Wales as well. The day's top temperature 22. Now this weekend, low pressure is going to be bringing these weather fronts across the country. They clear through, so Sunday looks like being the better of the 2 days of the weekend. But Saturday, certainly there'll be rain around, and some of it looks to be pretty heavy as well. The rain tending to push eastwards with showers following to Northern Ireland, Wales and the southwest. The day's top temperature, again, around about 22, maybe 23 degrees Celsius across eastern areas. Then for Sunday, the main rain band will begin to fade away from eastern England, and really we'll be left with a day of sunshine and showers. Now the showers could be really quite heavy, thundery and potentially slow moving across parts of the Midlands, central southern England and perhaps the southeast. So we'll need to keep a close eye on those heavy downpours. If that's all too depressing, Clive, next week should be dry with some sunshine.
Hooray! Chris, thank you for that. Chris Fawkes there. And that's it. So goodbye from me. Now on BBC One, time for the news where you are. Have a very good evening.